Well, welcome today to this latest in the series of webinars. A little bit unusual, this one, because instead of looking at activities, we're going to look at things just to do with reviewing. And I guess it's a question we get asked a lot particularly when we're talking to people who don't know us or are new to individual activities. And that question is often, so how should I review this experiential learning activity? So I'm not sure I'll cover that entirely today, but I'm going to hopefully cover some things in terms of how we might answer that question in relation to general experiential learning or any specific. So for those of you who don't know, my name's Graham Cook. I look after the product business and RSVP design, and Kim, my colleague, is in the background helping us as we go along. Those of you who've been in contact will maybe have had some notes from Kim, who looks after our sales and marketing. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, we're going to have a look at what we call the review of the experience, wherever that may be. And generally, from our point of view, we're typically talking about some kind of experiential learning activity. And I'm going to cover a little bit on review first. We'll then look at a few of the text-based activities and how you might use them. Those of you who have been on some of our webinars before will maybe have seen one that we did just looking at image-based activities, so this is a little bit different. And then I've said questions at the end. I hope I don't run out of time, but in case I do, if you've got a question, stick it into the chat to Kim. If Kim can answer it straight away, she will. If not, she'll interrupt me, and I'm happy to have questions as we go along. Is that all good? And by all means, I think most people are going to be on mute, just so we don't get a lot of background. But if there's something really important, then please do open your mic and give me a shout. Happy to have that. So here at RSVP Design, we use the term experiential learning to refer to, I guess, a very specific form of learning, which comes from the work of David Kolb. And I say that because, you know, I'm well aware that particularly in the US, experiential learning tends to be a term applied to the accreditation of prior learning, often used in educational settings. And increasingly, I guess, the word gamification covers a little bit of what we do in terms of learning design. But I also think that's a little bit different. We don't have a huge amount of time to go into all of that today. But generally, what we are talking about is the going around this Kolb cycle. So a lot of what we do is supply the experience you can see at the top there. So that's any kind of experience where we act or do something. And then our job as facilitators generally is to help people notice and observe what went on, or to reflect what went on, to help them understand and conclude maybe why things happened, and then look at applying those testing conclusions or applying that in the next piece of learning. So that's the cycle and essentially the learning model that underpins what we're talking about today. So all four stages are really important, and we find this particularly with people who are new to experiential learning. Sometimes there's a tendency just to jump ahead or to miss out some of these. And if you do that, then certainly for learners, they run the risk of jumping to conclusions, or while they may understand what went on, the really important bit and why most, I guess, corporate learners are in business is to help their learners apply the learning in the future. Typically in our work, a lot of it is about helping to change behaviours in the workplace. There's a secondary reason for going through all four stages, though, and that's if we can help our trainees become more skilled experiential learners, it will help them to make more sense of any kind of learning experience, not just in the training room, and hopefully help it be a more continuous, lifelong process. And then the final bit is if we're directing that interrogation back to individuals, then any learning that people identify for themselves tends to be more powerful, it tends to be memorable, and it tends to be longer lasting. And hopefully that's where we get the move to behaviour change. So again, maybe just a summary of what a good review should include. And again, kind of leading on from that, it should have some kind of process, I think, for remembering what has happened and reflecting upon that. So the first thing is, you know, seeking to raise this awareness of what happened. So again, our job is usually observing to try and identify patterns of individual and group behaviour. any choices or decisions that were made, and so on. And really, hopefully, if we're working with learners over a period of time, once they develop those skills in observing and discriminating between behaviours, they can move on to evaluating the effect of these behaviours. And of course, that's not just important in the training room, that's really important back in the workplace, and leads into all sorts of areas of management and leadership responsibility. So in that next phase of review, we're really looking to question the impact and the effects of the behaviour, and to try and evaluate what's been going on. So we're requiring learners to make the connections between what they noticed and what it might mean. So again, we're not saying why, we're not providing our ideas, we're trying to help them draw conclusions from what they have experienced. So it's a very different role from a typical trainer or presenter who's giving information to people. You're really trying to help facilitate learning from these. And again, these conclusions are going to be different. They'll only be valuable if they're personally relevant. So it's perfectly reasonable to have 12 people in a training session and 12 people leaving with different learning. We can't force people to learn something. They have to be receptive to it, and they have to develop that themselves. And really, the third stage is probably the bit, again, where we're leading to, is about learners thinking how, where, and when they can use that learning from the experience and what benefits they might have from doing this. And I think that's really important, because in my experience as both a manager and leader in larger organizations, it's a really brave manager or leader who leaves the training room and says, I'm going to walk in and try a new management style or a new leadership style tomorrow. Usually the opportunity to try these things out is actually in the training room, and experiential learning provides that opportunity to do that. So it should be a preparation for applying the learning, but it's also a practice field, as we call it, so a place where you can do it without risk. So within that cycle, as I say, of the 4 areas, we're really going to focus mostly on stages 2 and 3 there. So after the experience, the reflection and the conclusion, and maybe a little bit in terms of application towards the end. So the first thing is, let's look at some alternatives for reviewing, because there's more than one way, obviously, to manage a review. And in this stage, we're talking about probably all 3 stages. The most common way, of course, is simply to ask a selection of questions. And I guess that's where most of us would start from. And again, probably a couple of simple ways to do that if you're in groups. You can ask a question of the whole group in plenary straight after the activity, but be aware that tends to allow the most vocal and confident learners to respond. So depending on what types of learners you're dealing with, you maybe want to find more equitable ways of doing that. If you want to split them up into small groups to get more voices, then be aware that it takes a bit more time. They need time to develop their answers and then report back either in their sub-teams or potentially in plenary. But if you're going to be using questioning at those stages, particularly in reflection and conclusion, the choice of the type of questions you use is really important. So it's worth pointing out that it can really be quite counterproductive to ask a group why they did something. Going through this process and this cycle, it's much more valuable to try and focus on what they did, the effect it had, and what they might do in the future as a result of their learning. So if you can keep questions to those kind of areas, I think that's useful. So for example, typically these can always, of course, be done in advance, and probably should be. So you'll have some specific learning objectives. So creating questions and based on the activity that was chosen should be possible to be done in advance. So let's say you were trying to take a team through a problem-solving process. So the questions that you use could lead learners through a step-by-step process of solution finding, and that would be allowing them to create their own theory, but ensuring there's some kind of common learning to take away from the experience. So questions like that could be, what did you do at the beginning to ensure that you all understood the problem? What was your understanding of the success criteria for an acceptable solution? How would you know if you'd solved the problem? How did you go about generating alternative options? What was your process for testing and evaluating ideas? How did you make your decision about your chosen solution and how successful was your? So that's a step-by-step problem-solving process that you can do in reflection to the activity you've just done. And another reason I think it's useful for that is that as trainers and facilitators, we don't have the luxury of seeing our trainees in the workplace typically. So we've got them in the training environment, so it's worthwhile checking in that what's going on is still relevant for them back in the workplace. So alternatives to questions, one useful way for getting individual responses quickly, for example, rather than the most vocal people in the group, might be, let's look at a physical scale. So across your room, take an imaginary line 0 to 100%. Frame a question, ask people to choose a numerical value and position themselves. So immediately they get to see their reactions versus other people's and how that changed. So, for example, it might be how confident were you at the start of the exercise that you would achieve the task. And lots of questions I'm sure you can pull out from that allows people just a bit of movement apart from anything else, as sometimes review areas can be quite sedentary, people sitting around talking, whereas maybe you want to get them a little bit more mobile and up and out of their chairs. A final alternative is just I'm going to pick on, there are lots, of course, is some kind of visual review technique. So we've used the John Adair model for a long time. So a very simple model that looks at leadership in terms of what leadership of groups. The first thing is what has to happen to get the job done, just as relevant in business as it is in the experiential activity. What needs to happen to maintain and develop the team, and what do we have to do to support individual team members? So these things typically are going on all of the time for leaders, and I guess leadership is that kind of intersection of this Venn diagram in the middle, looking after the task, the individual needs and the team needs. But it's really rare that they're all the same size, and that relative importance will shift as things shift. And sometimes it's useful as part of that review to take a look at that. So if we're doing it over a timeline, maybe a longer activity, some of our physical activities might be 45 minutes activity. So on the left there, that red is very much about the task, and that's typical of, if you're absolutely focusing on the task to the exclusion of other things, it's usually because of some kind of crisis or deadline, and it might be appropriate at that point. If you're shifting to more of your attention as leader on the team, then it's to do typically with team conflict, interpersonal issues, and obviously in the green, maybe on a one-to-one basis with a team member. So again, using visual techniques to try and get a framing of what actually happened in the activity. And in all cases, you'll notice I'm not interested necessarily in how well or successful people are in the task. And it's a question we get asked a lot when it comes to review, would really like people to be successful in this task, or do we have a task that we can do? Certainly any experiential learning task that RSVP would provide would be achievable. We certainly don't believe in giving people impossible tasks. They have to be able to achieve it, but often they're challenging. So it's certainly possible that groups may not be successful. And as we probably know, for many groups, there's more learning in that than there is in being able to do something relatively easy. And if you're working with adult learners, that's particularly vital. Adult learners do need some degree of challenge in order to be getting engaged. So I'm conscious I'm kind of rattling through at a fair pace. I'm going to be talking at you a fair bit. Any questions or any comments on any of that before we look at some very specific based text tools, or how are we doing? Give me a thumbs up if we're okay. Great, thank you, Jane. Thank you, Helen. Good, okay. As I see, if you've got, jump in.
But just I had a question that was relevant to that point before we move on.
Sure.
The idea of scale and the responding across a room is great.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any suggestions for how we transfer that into the virtual realm?
Yeah, I mean, I guess on a whiteboard you could do something similar in terms of a graph and ask people to put dots on it. Yeah, so
Yeah.
you know, that's probably the easiest way, I think, just to kind of simulate that type of thing. Yeah. I mean, if you get them to stand up from the screen and go as far away as they want to be, you might lose them. But yeah, and there are probably tools out there that you could get that would do that. But yeah, I think it's a good point, Nick. I'm typically talking about physical activities, but obviously, yes, these things, some of these things would be just as relevant in terms of online.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's jump forward and have a look at a few of the text-based activities and how we might use them. So a couple of things to point out. The first is that these are language dependent. Not often, but all of the ones I'm going to show are written in English with English words and based on our kind of quite wide vocabulary in English. So you probably want English as a first language for many people. And I realize that's an issue, particularly from my point of view, because RSVP design wants to and tries to support learners in all parts of the world. So other options are going to images. And I'll mention them a little bit, but images are a very good way of getting over this issue of language sometimes. Or indeed to create your own text-based prompts. And certainly for some of the tools that I know there are translated versions. So if you have particular interest in particular languages, then please do get back in touch. So generally we're talking about trying to widen vocabulary here for people, or give them a vocabulary that they can select from. Often not necessarily because they don't have the vocabulary. If you're dealing with younger learners, they may not have. But often senior learners, senior executives, are so used to in business talking in jargon that sometimes going into some of these areas is a challenge for them, and giving them a selection of vocabulary to work with can actually be really useful. The other thing I should point out just before I start is that none of these activities were designed by RSVP Design. So quite happy and to carry and promote good tools. I guess our focus is mainly on the activity ourselves rather than creating particular review tools. So the first one I wanted to introduce is something called Good Question Cards. This is a new activity for us. So new that I didn't quite manage to get it launched on our e-commerce site before I started. So apologies for that. Kim is going to send you in chat links to the various individual tools as I go along. So you won't have it for this one, but when we get it up, hopefully in time for Santa arriving, if you want to purchase some tools for people, we should have it on next week. So again, as we kind of fairly obvious statement, but the questions we ask can have a huge impact on how we and others think, feel, and behave. And this particular tool comes from the idea of appreciative and constructive questions. So it's a deck of 48 questions, but all of them look to the positive areas. It's from a company called At My Best. We also carry their strength cards, which we really like. But the good question cards are something that we've just added. So you can see on the bottom there, they've got a couple of suggestions for how you might use them as a standalone deck in change programs and things like building trust and working with teams. But as we go through this, I'm just going to look at how I might use some of these in terms of looking at review of an experiential activity. So I guess the first thing is in terms of reflecting on what's just happened. The way the good question game is structured, there are 6 families. There are 8 questions in each area, all appreciative questions. So about appreciating yourself, appreciating others, the kind of wider appreciation, raising self-awareness, seeing the world differently and creating change. And you'll notice a fair overlap between lots of topics that we get asked about. So review, emotional intelligence, giving feedback, strengths, values, all of these things kind of tend to overlap a little bit. And as training designers and facilitators, I think it's also worth thinking, sometimes in your review, can you get more bang for your buck in terms of what you're asking people to do? Could you not only review the activity to look at teamwork development, but also give people practice in offering good quality feedback, for example, and I'll touch on that a little bit. So potentially, yes, you could use these questions to explore the positive aspects of a learning program in groups. A bit more difficult to use those questions if you're trying to look at what might have gone wrong, if that's what you wanted to do. And I would also advise sorting the cards in advance, because there are some questions that are much probably more suited to things like one-to-one coaching in terms of these questions. So I've pulled out some just to give you an example of some of the questions, and hopefully you can see them on there. So these are from the different families. So you may want to say, so this would be in relation to an activity, so you might have to slightly reframe it. So if you're looking in groups, it might be, well, based on our experience as a team in that activity, what makes you hopeful for the future? So if this is a new team you're working for with, then that question might be relevant. On the right hand side, how do you know when you've done good work? So you could reflect that back and say, the activity we've just done, you know, what good work did you do and how would you know? So again, you're giving people practice in asking those appreciative questions, even though it's relating to reviewing the activity. If you're using it towards the end of a program, you could look at the questions on the left. What were the top 3 experiences so far if we did multiple activities? What are the things that matter most to you in this program? What has inspired you, and so on. So hopefully you get a sense of the types of questions included in this program. Moving on to the feedback game. Feedback game is similar but different in a couple of important ways. Probably the most important way is that it has 140 cards and many more words, but split into evenly 70 strengths and 70 weaknesses. So I was using this, actually. I was down in London running a workshop, an open workshop with a group for the first time in 2.5 years, thanks to COVID. It was really interesting because I was talking about culturally some of the differences in working with groups. So the At My Best cards is British. Some English people have developed it. The feedback game developed by Peter Gerrikens in the Netherlands. If you work with the Dutch, they're a very direct race, so they would probably have no problem in sitting down in a group and asking people to talk about their weaknesses as well as their strengths. Some cultures, probably including the UK, that's a bit more of a challenge. But we did this activity in London last week, and I was working with a really effervescent, very open HR woman who was working with me. And when we got to this, where we had to, give people cards based on strengths that they had observed, she really found that difficult, and it's a really British thing, trying to accept praise for your strengths. Everything else we'd been working on all day was fine, but actually having someone hand a card and say, I think I saw a strength in this area was a real challenge for us. And I've not quite understood that. I think it's something as Brits we probably need to get over a little bit. So again, using it in this way gives people that practice in terms of feedback. If you're interested in feedback as a subject, just got a very long and very useful manual about it. And of course, part of the reason for using this is, if you see at the top there, it's about self-discovery as well. You may discover that you're enterprising. So sometimes looking at these kind of large array of words and one of the ways to use it outside of reviews is to get people just to rank them in order. Take these 70 cards and give me the 5 that you see as your 5 most important strengths. Might be one way that you do it. So lots of opportunities to use it. But one of the ways I like to use it within having just done an activity would be to put all of the cards out. So again, maybe put all 70 out and just ask people to sort through them. It's hard to kind of do that, so I'm just going to show you a few of the words on screen. So have a look at those words and think about the activity you've just gone through and pick up a card where you can see a strength that someone else brought to the activity. And it has to be something you observe. So I can't say, well, I've known Nick for a long time. I know he's really honest. So here you are, Nick, here's an honesty card. It has to be something that I saw. So it might be, Helen, I noticed when, you were really kind when I was struggling with it. You took the time to, help me go through the activity. So you're doing 2 things. You're helping people to notice what the behavior was in the activity, but as I said earlier, you're also giving them the option to practice some skills of giving good feedback based on observable behaviors. So hopefully get a bit of a bang for your buck. So here's some more of the words. So there's lots of words, and despite the fact it was originally developed in Dutch, they've obviously used some native English speakers to do these translation, because there is a really good and broad selection of things that you would say as strengths on these cards. I would always say be careful when you use them. I probably wouldn't use weakness cards in an activity review other than for some personal reflection. So I might ask people to not even necessarily pick one up, but maybe to note it down themselves. Have a look through the weakness cards. Was there anything in these words that you recognise has shown up in the past? Maybe something you would want to work with, and maybe it showed up during the activity. And maybe if people are brave enough and want to open up, you would ask them what they were. So again, there are 70, some of them are very blunt, as that one down in the middle goes. So again, I would also suggest if you want to use these, you maybe want to sort through them and see which ones you would want to show. But an interesting deck. Next one I want to jump to was the feelings game, also developed by Peter and one of his colleagues in the Netherlands. This is a little bit different, and it's one that we haven't carried for a long time. And I guess when I initially saw it, and I presume where it came from, it was developed particularly for younger people, and also maybe more for one-to-one work. But I do think it could have a place in getting people to understand the issue of how feelings then move on to, behavioral impacts. Again, I haven't asked the question of Peter, but I think I should, why he's got 36 pleasant feelings, but can come up with 60 unpleasant feelings cards. But we won't go into maybe that too much. There are also 32 image cards that I touched on earlier, which might be useful if English isn't the first language, and 16 areas of life, which you can see some of them here. I wouldn't use these in review, because I think anytime we're doing a review, what I'm talking about is in a business context. There are obviously lots of other contexts that you could use the subject and discuss feelings. And again, it's about opening up those wider conversations. So here's a selection of some of the image cards. For some they may be a bit simplistic, but I think you could see where these drawings or these illustrations are meant to indicate a particular feeling. Kim did ask me about the little person being sick in the bottom right, but I guess, if that's the physical reaction, then probably just before it you weren't feeling too good. So those of you interested in image cards, I think we've got about 25, 26 decks. So there's a separate webinar that's recorded if you wanted to look at just using imagery. So again, in terms of reflecting and maybe concluding how people were feeling as you go through an activity, and this is not just the effect of the activity itself. If you hate problem solving and puzzles and you're being asked to do a puzzle, that might, your feelings might not be great. It's also the feelings caused by the interpersonal relationships you have during that. So, and I would suggest you just mix the unpleasant and pleasant ones, and maybe people won't notice there's twice as many unpleasant as pleasant, but some of them I would probably pick up. So again, going back to what Nick was saying, you could do this on a timeline basis, and you could ask people to select even online if you have a selection to pick. So it might be, how were you at the start? How were you in the middle? How were you towards the end? So here's a selection of some of the unpleasant feelings words. And I've tried to pick words out I think could be more relevant and could be experienced, if you like, in an activity at any point in time. So words like, angry would be unusual. I would hope people wouldn't get to the point of being angry, but that means different things to different people. And also getting them to unpack once they've picked their cards, explaining why and what went on would be useful, why you felt discriminated against, for example. Here are some of the more positive ones. Pleasantly surprised. I realise that surprise isn't always a pleasant experience for some people, but lots of useful words then there. And again, as I say, it's about giving people a vocabulary to pick from more than anything else. So let me just pause. I can see there's a couple of questions in chat. Anyone got anything they wanted to raise with me just now over this? Okay, so far again, just give me a thumbs up or open your mic if you've got a question. All good, great. So the next deck, and these typically do be decks as they've all got text on them, is something around developing emotional intelligence. Again, it's a request we often get, things like, do you have activities for leadership? Do you have an activity for emotional intelligence? And our response often to this one is, well, you can kind of do any activity that's going to get people engaged. You could then debrief in terms of emotional intelligence, because you could look at what was happening in that, how people noticed what was going on and so on, rather than the content of emotional intelligence. So in terms of theory, but you could also introduce it, and if you haven't introduced the subject before. So again, most people probably know that we would suggest there's two ways of using an experiential activity. One would be to run the activity. Sometimes we say catch people in the act of being themselves. So you have an experience which you've all witnessed and done, and then you can include some theory. So we might run colorblind if you know it, and then talk about emotional intelligence, and then you can review that in that terms of that frame. Or we could introduce the subject of emotional intelligence, then do an activity, and then review it against that. So a couple of ways to do that. But generally, we're talking about this ability to understand emotions in self and others. And the purpose of playing the game, if you like, for its game's sake, is to stimulate that reflection in the conversation, typically between a coach and a coachee, or perhaps a small group. So if you haven't seen this deck before, there are essentially 48 cards in the 4 emotional intelligence suits or domains. There are 4 summary cards which explain those a little bit more, and 3 setup and suggested use. So the suggested use are literally maybe sitting down a manager and an employee, or a coach and a coachee, a couple of people running through this as an activity in abstract. But you could certainly use it as part of a review process. And again, this might be in the reflection stage, moving on to conclusions, or even thinking about applying that learning back in the workplace, or even in the next activity. So certainly it's a case that we can develop our own emotional intelligence. So it's a skill you can build. It's not something that's innate. It can be developed, but it requires a combination of quality introspection and reflection, and focusing on others. And again, I think it's useful to remember as trainers the time pressure we are always under. So I always get challenges for people saying, I need an activity that I can do in an hour, you know. So there's no point in me giving a 45-minute activity and then only having 15 minutes for the review. So this idea of, if you want to develop quality introspection, you need to give people some time and space for reflection. And I know as internal HR people or as external consultants, that's really difficult to do and to fight for. But I think you really need to fight for that if you're going to use this style of learning. So there are 4 categories. So if you've done a lot of work in emotional intelligence, which I have to say I haven't, but I understand the basics, the 4 categories are self-awareness, social awareness, self-management, and relationship management are the 4 category areas. I've asked for this self-awareness and social awareness because I haven't seen the primary research, but I understand that consistently when leaders self-score themselves in emotional intelligence, consistently these are the 2 that they overrate their capabilities in: self-awareness and social awareness. So if you're working in areas of leadership, again, it might be a way you can sneak in some more EI development by getting them to use this style, not necessarily this deck, but this style of a review and these styles of questions. So one way would obviously, if you've got the resources, using them in pairs, you know, referencing the questions, firstly in relation to the activity completed, and then maybe moving on to a wider context. So person with the card. You could also, particularly I think if an activity isn't going well, you know, there's no reason in a 45-minute activity, you have to run to the end and then do all the review. There's no reason why you can't stop in the middle, do a midpoint review, whether it's going well or whether it's going poorly, you know, stop for a break, come back. Certainly most activities we have would be capable of doing that. But if you're wanting to if you don't have time to do another one, but you're wanting people to change or try something different, you know, stop at midway and then look for a change in how the activity progresses in the second half. And using these cards might be a random way of doing it. Asking them to move it at the end. So when you're moving into action planning, next steps at the end of your program, thinking of how they might apply learning from the activity or the program itself is certainly a possibility. So just to give you an example of some of the questions, here are, I think I've said there's 12, so here are 8 of the questions. So you can see in each case, there's a question on each card. So how did you contribute to this situation? So if we're stopping halfway through the activity and it's not going well, we might ask that question. There's a little further explanation underneath that. So it says, if you can't read it, encouraging a self-coaching approach. So you're encouraging people to ask themselves this question quite often. And the tip is, do not allow a list of self-blame and do encourage active reflection. So these cards are quite useful if people are inexperienced in coaching each other's. I like the fact there's a bit of an explanation and there's a tip of how to use them. And again, if anyone needs more time, obviously you can go back and review this, or if you need more information on these cards, then just let us know. So sorry, let me go back because that was the next domain. So in self-management, some interesting ones there as well. You know, how do you feel after taking 3 deep breaths? You know, if you're getting into a bit of conflict in an activity, and I have seen that done, you know, that might be useful to pull out and look at some of these in terms of self-management. What unhelpful emotions, limiting belief can you let go at this point in terms of an activity, or how can you show a flexible approach here if people are coming to a head, and how to move forward. And moving on to social awareness. And again, remember, this is one of the ways where people tend to overrate their own capabilities. I like this question quite often, useful in a review. How are others around you feeling right now? You know, and again, Nick, that's probably a really good one, I think, in a remote session, you know, because you don't get that extra information. What power dynamics are at play here? Again, maybe a bit more explosive, but that would be an interesting one again, particularly in terms of remote teams. And then the final domain area is relationship management. Again, it's I think I see this a lot in not just the UK but internationally, and when we do things like creativity, using challenging assumptions, getting people to be innovative, and we run little activities and subgroups. You know, it's like being back at school where people hide their work. You know, they don't get up and look at each other. Companies complain that everyone's working in silos. And again, as I say, I don't know if it comes from our idea of school that and our formal education all over the world, which is, you know, you have to come up with the answers yourself. But this question, how does it feel to ask for and use others' ideas, I think is a really interesting question to pose of people in the middle or even at the end of a session when you haven't seen any collaboration. I'm not sure about this one live. How do you work with those you don't like? But it might be an interesting one-to-one question. And what can you learn from them? I don't know if those are meant to go together or not, but I would probably put them together as a follow-up. What can you learn from people you don't like? Maybe that's another topic. So again, so rather than looking at emotional intelligence activity itself, look at reviewing it against emotional intelligence is probably how I would suggest, and do suggest to most people when they ask us about that type of thing. So I'm doing not too badly. I was going to finish in terms of activities with, again, a new activity to us, a product called feedback frames. This was invented by a guy in Canada, and we started to carry it a little while ago. He's used it in lots of different contexts, which I'm sure you can understand when you understand what the product is about. But I think it's got a place for trainers in each of these 3 areas. And it came from something we probably all know, that any traditional group decision-making technique, particularly with sticky dots and so on, is riddled with inefficiencies and social biases. So what I was just talking about with Nick, if you're doing it on a whiteboard, everyone can see what came before. So if everyone's on one part of the board, the temptation is to go with the rest of them. So what's an easy way of doing that? And of course, there are kind of online surveys and so on you can do anonymously, but I like the idea of being able to set up something quickly and do it in the moment in a session. So it's a very simple analog tool. What you see in that picture is exactly right. It's bits of paper and cardboard. And it's for secret score voting on as many options as you want. And the idea is that you cover a screen so that when you drop a token in a range of slots, people don't know what everyone else has voted for, and you don't find that until the end. So I've got a little video here that just kind of explains, well, it doesn't explain because there's no audio with it, but it does indicate what's going on. And I'll try and talk through it. It's about 30 seconds or so, just to give you a sense of what's going on here. So you can see people are coming up. At the end, they reveal it. So they're given counters. You've got a statement that you can just print off. So you're writing any statement that you want people to rate. Each box, I think, comes with 8 different frames. So you can have lots of things you want people to vote on. That are fixed, like numbers 1 to 5 are positive to negative, but you can even change those coloured screens in the back there, as they're just screens that go behind it. And certainly in place of, sorry, let me just kind of review what you get into it. So when you're setting up, that's what it looks like. As I say, you get eight frames which come with their own little stand. You get tokens you can hand out to people, and what you want to know is that everybody voted. So what you do, you can see maybe in the bottom right of that sheet in front of it, there's a little signature list. So you just sign when you've deposited your token, and then we know we've got the right number of people for the right number of tokens. You've got scale sheets, frame covers that you can all adapt and change. So it doesn't need, as I say, strong agreement to not. It could be, project A, B, C, and D, or whatever you want. Where I thought they might be useful for, and I've kind of used them a little bit, is to get a quick review. Again, if you're limited for time and review, but you want to capture something, particularly if you're feeding back to someone else about the activity. A conversation I had in London, and I have a lot of the time with people, is that if they're introducing experiential learning, which is quite new to the organization, or maybe to the budget holder or the executive who's looking for the training, when they see, we've got 15 minutes of content and then 7 hours of playing games, they sometimes get a little bit concerned. So, and then when they have the feedback after it, where people say, well, actually the best bit of this activity was the 7 activities we did, and the lecture at the start was really boring. So getting this in a way that's pretty conclusive and is pretty neutral can be useful. So you can get it really, really quickly, just in terms of the positivity of the activity, if you're feeding back. However, you can also get data across cohorts, so you can look at performance. You can ask any questions you want to basically. So if you're trying to quickly look at data across a whole organization, if you imagine, you've got 8 different questions to ask, it would take 10 seconds for the group to do this before they depart the room, rather than giving them a follow-up form and hoping that they'll complete it and you having to chase them 3 or 4 times. So that's where the main benefits I see. And then I guess finally, if you're helping the group move into action planning, so if you're working with real intact teams, you've done some training and development, you've taken them through it, you've helped them to conclude what was going on for them that they could change in the workplace. You've now got it helping them to identify a series of things they could put in place. Why not get them to vote on them and prioritize them before they actually leave the training room? So useful for that. And of course, the dreaded happy sheets. I had to fill one in again in London last week with a lot of things that, it took me 5 minutes when I was running for the train. It'd be much easier. I'm going to sell them one of these boards, and if they don't buy it, I'm going to give them one so I can just drop some tokens in next time I'm there. So that's feedback frames, relatively new to us, but if you're looking to get a lot of kind of data that you wanted to pass on to people, might be useful. So either I've talked far too fast because I actually about 45 minutes. I didn't give people much chance for getting involved, so apologies for that. It was more of a lecture than a participative webinar. But again, happy to take questions on any of those or any other areas around review that I can try and answer for you where we've got a little bit of time. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great Christmas when it arrives, and hopefully we'll see you soon.